All right, good to see everybody this evening. I'm sure you turned in to hear a little bit about maple, and basically, you with Shad, Phil, and I, that's something we enjoy talking about is maple syrup, and we've it's something that we get to share about quite often, and I know you all probably been in uh, workshops or what have you with one of at least one of the three of us or something. So, but today we're going to talk about backyard maple syrup, and basically this is the basics, and that's why I wanted to show this. That's literally my backyard. That's where I literally work from on my evaporation of maple, and so that's kind of where the end process stops at that point in time. But so what is maple? Maple syrup. It's a naturally occurring sweetener made by concentrating the sap of maple trees. We're just trying to boil that water off, pretty much. It's long been used as a sweetener in North America, and recent studies in Canada actually indicate that the maple syrup has an antioxidant properties that could be that are actually a health benefit. So it may be sweet, but that's a good thing that it's a definitely good health benefit. It takes about 43 to 60 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, and can vary by tree. During the middle of the year, it can change. It also changes seasonally, year to year, and we may talk about that, a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So here's the type of maple trees. The three main types or three of the type of maple trees that we look at. Definitely sugar maples. Sugar maples typically have the highest sugar content, and they can run 2 to 3%, and they can actually be a lot higher than that. I know Shad is working. He's got some what's called super sugars that he's planted in his yard, and I think even planted his office that supposedly will have a little bit higher sugar content. And that's what we want. We want the highest sugar content possible. Red maples, there's somewhat of a lower sugar content historically when we look at maple trees. Then you have the silver maples, and I bring silver maples in here because we do have a lot of silver maples, and I've actually tapped silver maples and mixed it with red and sugar. It has a lower sugar content. It can be around 1%. So what all that means is, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, but you have to boil it a little bit longer. I will mention as well, we don't have it in there, box elder maple. There has been some work done. I know Shad and Phil worked with some folks at UVA Wise, and they actually use some box elders as well. So there's a possibility of that. And they even said how it had a really good flavor to it. You wouldn't think that, considering that it smells and attracts box elder bugs. So, but that's another possibility. The sugar content can change year to year, and it can also change during the season as well. So a little bit about tree ID. We still have leaves on our maple trees, and so if this is something you want to get into right now, in the next week probably is a good time to go out there. Maybe even a couple weeks. They may still have a few leaves hanging on there. But there's a sugar maple. That gives you an idea. You see that those deep oranges in there and those leaves, and then you can see the shape of the leaf as well. There's a red maple, and if you'll notice it has the darker red colors this time of year, and you can see the shape of that leaf is not as wide as that sugar maple, and the lobes are not as deep as well. Then we have the silver maple, and this is typically your maples that you'll see that are common in your yards, people's yards, that sort of thing. The reason I tapped it is my dad and mom have 2 of these in their front yard, and so when I started tapping, I grabbed some silver maples, and it worked for me. Like I said, though, you're dealing with a sugar content that's a little bit lower. So choosing that right maple to tap. You want to look for a healthy tree that are at least 10 inches in diameter and 4.5 foot above the ground. And like I said, a healthy tree is the main thing. If you got a tree that's that broken in the top, and I had a great tree a few years back that produced very well, and windstorm knocked quite a bit of a huge limb out of it, really big limb out of it. And when it did, that hurt it the next year. So you want to look at the healthy trees. You don't want to look at something that's old and just really bad looking. Look at the healthy trees because they're going to produce the best. Look for trees with the crowns that are broad and deep. Leaves are the food producers. Leaves are the big things. The more leaves they have on those, the more they're going to they're going to store sugar, and they're going to be your best producers. Also, make sure they're easily accessible. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but how far do you have to walk to get to them to gather sap? For instance, currently the trees that I have where I'm gathering sap from is basically there's a road that goes up a holler, and the trees are either above the road or below the road. And so very easily accessible. So you got to figure out how far you're going to have to walk to gather that sap. So I want to talk a little bit about supplies. And supplies are some of the first things that you want to buy. And you may even want to start buying now, between now and tapping season at the end of December, 1st of January. But here's some of the supplies that I have acquired over the years. You're going to have taps or spiles, and I've got a few examples laying here, and we'll look at them. At the end of the presentation. But you want to have those taps or spiles. Do you need tubing? And I'll show you a little bit about what I use for tubing. A cordless drill and a drill bit. Now, back in the day, they used a brace and bit, and those work just fine. But I really like a cordless drill. And when I mentioned drill bits, the wood drill bits work good, but if you can get an actual tapping bit for maple, it's well worth it. Those things are going to run about $8 or $10, maybe as high as 12, but it's well worth it, and they'll last a little bit longer. The bit doesn't walk off in the tree. I know you've drilled into lumber before or what have you, and that bit will try to walk off. With a maple tapping bit, it won't walk off the way that the tip is made. You're going to have some collection containers. Now we're talking backyard here, so things like food grade buckets, milk jugs, transport containers, that sort of thing. So you want to have that. A rubber mallet or a hammer for the tapping for the taps. You need to have something to transport and store that container, storage container for the sap. You're going to have evaporation pan or pans, a warming pot or multiple warming pots, a cooking stove for your evaporator or evaporator I mentioned there. So either one. So something that you're using a heating source. Fuel. Some of the fuel sources are wood or propane. And personally, I use propane. It has worked for me, and I'm small, so it works. But look at what you may need there. Some filters. You may want to filter that sap prior to putting it in your evaporator pans. Also, you'll want to filter, and we'll talk a little bit about it later. You'll want to filter that syrup after it comes off. You'll need a candy thermometer or a hydrometer or refractometer. Definitely you want a thermometer, but you want a hydrometer or a refractometer as well. That may be something you want to look at. You need a finishing pot as well, because you want to finish that syrup. And then you got to have those syrup containers, however it may be. You may buy some of the nice little syrup jugs. that you can buy at Maple Supply locations, but also you may just, canning jars work great. So those supplies, and I didn't bring it with me, but I sat down and I came up with a total of what they cost us to put something together for this. And basically, you're looking at less than $200. Everything that I have there, minus, say, the cooking stove and the fuel, propane. If you already have your source there, your heat source, you're looking at about $160, I think, what I come up with for about 20 taps. So that's not too bad. And the taps you change out every year. You'll throw those away at the end of the season, but the rest of this stuff you'll continue to use. So what you want to have is clean equipment. You want to start out with clean equipment. You want to clean everything before, after, and even during the process. Make sure you have everything clean before you start, and then make sure you're cleaning it afterwards. And it's easier to clean afterwards than it is the next day. Also, even during the processes. One of the things that I've learned with the pans that I use, if they're a little bit warm and I've got some warm water, those things are easier to clean before all that that syrup just gums up on it and gets sticky. It's easier to clean. You want to wash all your equipment, your buckets, your evaporation pans, that sort of thing. I mentioned two things here, and I've never really had to use it, but may need to use a chemical milkstone remover to clean boiling pans. Those boiling pans, they'll kind of get kind of a white, crusty substance on them, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you may end up having to use a milkstone remover. Also, rinse with dilute bleach solution. Don't use soap. And I will say, if you're using canning jars, do not use soap in those to clean those. Just rinse them out really hot water, and if you'll sterilize them in the oven, it'll take care of it. I did find out that I used soap one time. I used too much soap, and when I cracked the top on the maple syrup later, I had a soap taste to it. It tasted like soap because that maple syrup is really delicate and it will take on that flavor. So let's talk a little bit about drilling and tapping of the maples. We're going to select those healthy maples, something like less than 10 inches diameter, 8 to 10 inches, one tap. They'll say 10 to 15 inches, two taps. And if you go over, say 20 inches, 20 to 25 inches and above, you go three taps. I've learned one tap. I have trees that are beyond the 15 mark, and I always use one tap, and it works well for me. You're going to drill your tap. You're going to drill the hole in the tree about 1.5 inches to 2 inches at a slight upward angle. What I typically use is 3/4 of an inch. I go 3/4 of an inch deep. The spiles or the taps that I use are basically, I think they are, I remember the length of them, but basically when I drive those in there, I have about 3/4 of an inch beyond the end of the spout for the maple sap to collect. Also, do not place anything or blow shavings from the hole. A lot of times when you pull that drill bit out of there, there may be a few shavings in the hole. Don't blow in it. Don't take a stick and rake it out or anything like that. You may contaminate the hole. And when you contaminate that hole, thing is, when you first drill that hole, there's a foreign object that you're putting in there with that tap. So one of the things is that tree is going to start to seal that hole off. It's going to try to protect that tree because there is a foreign object in that tree. And so tapping, blowing in it, that just speeds that process up, or even, getting bacteria in there. So you don't want the bacteria in there. So place the tap place the tap into the hole and tap with a hammer or rubber mallet. Now I say tap. You're not driving number 16 nails in a 2x4. So you're just going to be just a you're going to tap it, just a light tap, and then all of a sudden you're going to hear a change in the sound. It's going to go. You're going to tap tap tap, and then it's going to hit a thud. At that point in time, just stop. But a hammer or rubber mallet works great. So tap until you hear that and feel a solid connection. Do not drive the tap all the way in. One, that can break the tap and damage the tree, but it could also affect the flow. If you drive that tap all the way in and the end of that tap reaches the back of that hole, there's nowhere for that sap to collect. And so therefore you're not going to get the flow from that tree or from that tap. Also, over tapping can hurt the tree, but it won't necessarily give the extra sap. So I typically stick to one tap personally. Under tapping reduces the yield of sap, but won't necessarily help the tree either. So, here's a toolbox that I carry into the woods with me on tapping day. I keep everything in that box. If you'll notice, I have my cordless drill laying there. My taps are there, everything I need. Now, if you'll notice, I'm using milk jugs. That's typically what I use as a milk jug, or I should say water jug. I will say I don't necessarily recommend jugs that have the milk in it. I call them milk jugs, but I don't recommend the jugs that have the milk in them because it seems like you cannot get all of that milk out. And what you'll end up with is you'll end up with an off smell in the jug. So typically use those water jugs and they work great. Here, Woody's on here tonight. This is something that he used the first couple of years, 2 or 3 years that he was in the maple business. He used a sled and tied a rope to it. He put all his supplies on there. He put his jugs on there, and he was able to tote that up the hill. And then he would take it. He would also go back the next day to collect sap in the jugs, and he was able to pack it back off the hill fairly easy with that. You're gonna have to have something together with. I use my ATV. Like I said, that's that road that I was talking about. That's easy accessible. And so all of my trees are either above that road or below that road. So there's your tap hole. And if you'll notice, there's sap that's already coming out. Now, when you tap these trees, there'll be times that you'll actually tap a tree and the sap starts to flow immediately. Then there are other times that you'll tap a tree and the sap, the tap hole will be dry. There'll be no sap coming out of it. Don't worry about that. Go ahead and drive the tap in there. Here's some other examples of the jugs that I've used. If you'll notice, I think you can see my cursor. If you'll notice, there is some sap that's collected in the bottom of these milk jugs. And what I have is, and I'll show you in a little bit, is I have a short piece of tubing, and it comes off the bottom of the tap, and it goes into the top of the milk jug through the cap. And the cap, the cap, I have a hole drilled in the top of it that allows the tubing to pass through, and it's tight so no foreign debris can get in there. And then it also has a wire that holds the jug up with the tap itself. Here's another picture of some sugar maples there, of the taps just hanging off there. And if you'll notice, they're in no height, they're not any, height, I've got some that are hanging high, some are low, but you can see a lot of those are low, just whatever was easy accessible. Those trees right there were under a hill, and that hill was a little steeper than the picture shows, and so it was really hard to access. So I kept those taps fairly low on the tree. So here's another option, as well as the buckets. I like the buckets. I've used the buckets, but one of the things with the bucket there on the left is you tend to get some debris in there. You'll get some, if it's wind's blowing, you'll get some stuff that comes off the trees. You'll get some leaves in there. And that's why I like the if I'm looking at hanging buckets on trees, I like the milk jugs. Also, that's a picture of my niece, and she was a great help with us one year. She helped us collect sap, so you got to have some good help along the way. Here's actually silver maples that I'd tapped. I think it was 2 or 3 there, and I run I think it was 3, and I made multiple taps and run those down into the top of a bucket. And so you could see the tubing that I used to come in there. I didn't have any connectors. Had I done this over, I would have had everything come in through a connector and drop in through one tubing, but I didn't have any connectors, so I had to drop all 5 tubes into the top of the bucket. Also, on the left, it shows one tree that was across a creek, and that tubing was about 20 to 25 feet long. And so I went over and tapped the tree and brought the bucket back over and hooked it to the post of a shed, and allowed me to collect the sap off of that maple tree. On the right is a tubing that is through the woods of a sugar bush that has tied several maple trees together, and they all come to one collection point as well. So I just wanted to give you a viewpoint of that. So measuring sap and syrup sweetness. Now that's we're getting toward the end here. Brix is what we're looking for. Brix is the measurement of sugar and the sap or the syrup. We also call it percentage. So a hydrometer or refractometer measures the sugar content by floating it in a sample of sap or syrup. I guess you could say that's a hydrometer, not a refractometer. I need to change the words there. A sap hydrometer and a syrup hydrometer is something you may need. That way you can see what the Brix is in your sap, and you want to know the Brix that's in your syrup as well. And Brix is measured in degrees as well. For example, the higher the Brix, the less boiling time it's going to take. For instance, a sugar maple with 3 Brix or 3% sugar means it has 3% sugar, 97% water, is better than a silver maple with 1 Brix that is 1% sugar and 99% water. So that's what you want. Is higher the Brix, less boiling time. Here's a hydrometer in a cup, and if you'll just notice, it's you can see the top of the cup, and it's floating in there, and it just shows that the syrup that's in there is tested at. You see the red line there that it is tested at 67% sugar. There's a refractometer. If you're a beekeeper, you may have one of these for honey. A lot of times, I think people use it for making wine and brewing as well. Also, on sap flow, that's going to depend on the weather. And there's days that once you start this stuff, you're gonna know days to go and check your collection tank, and there's going to be other days you're not going to worry about it. But yeah, it does depend on weather. So what you want to do is begin tapping when the future temperatures begin reaching 40 degrees during the day. And the sap flow happens when the temperatures are near 20 degrees at night and near 40 degrees during the day. So you want a fluctuation above 30, at 32. So we want to look at 32 at the freezing point. We want to look at that as our mean. And then we want it at night to drop down around 20, or at least quite a bit below 32, and at night to come up to near 40 degrees. Or it could even be higher than 40 degrees, but you want a great temperature fluctuation. Also, like I mentioned, temps must fall below and rise above 32 degrees. So early January is when we're going to begin to tap, but begin watching the weather in late December. There's a good chance sometime in late December, you may end up being able to tap. I know there was one year, I talked to a neighbor, and he had tapped the last week of December, and he caught a flow that I didn't catch because I waited till the first part of January. So start watching those temperatures in late December. Also, I want to note that holes that have no sap flow for around 7 days, they're in danger of drying up. And in other words, they'll quit flowing. Now, that's not a guarantee because I've had some that will actually stop flow maybe upwards of 7, 8, 10 days, and they won't necessarily dry up. So it just depends. So a little bit on sap management. Sugar maple can have up to 3% sugar and that 97% water. And that water is what we're trying to get rid of. So when collecting the sap, keep it cool. This stuff is just like milk. It's going to spoil. And it smells a lot like milk after it's spoiled. It smells a lot like spoiled milk when it does spoil. It's got that just really off flavor, really bad flavor to it. So we're going to keep it cool. So if the temperatures stay above 40, here's your option. You're going to either have to refrigerate it or you're going to have to boil it. You're going to have to evaporate. You're going to have to start making syrup. So what I tend to do is I try to shoot for Saturday as the day that I'm going to evaporate. Now, that doesn't always work out that way, but I try to shoot for Saturday. And so I have an old refrigerator, and I know the number of gallons that it's going to hold, and I'll start collecting on Sunday, and I'll collect all the way through Saturday morning if need be, and then I'll start Saturday evaporating. And I may be all day evaporating, but if those temperatures stay above 40, you may have to refrigerate or start evaporating, depending on how much you have. So if the sap gets cloudy or begins to smell, toss it out. Just get rid of it. Don't use it. That's gonna give your maple an off flavor, and but just get rid of it. So sap flow. One tree may produce 5 to 15 gallons of sap per season. Now, it may even be higher than that. I have a tree, I actually have 2 trees that I tap, have a single tap in those, and I know that there are multiple days in a row that I can go and collect well over, I've collected off one tree about 1.5 gallons in a 24-hour period. So I know I can collect over 1 gallon. And so it just depends on the season, how the flow is. Also, low flow may produce only a few ounces. One of those pictures that I showed you earlier of the toolbox sitting in front of it, that is a tree. That's one of my biggest sugar maple trees, and it doesn't produce. As a matter of fact, I quit tapping it, and it will not produce. It has a low flow, and it just does not want to produce. So here's my setup, or I should say my original setup. I've changed it a little bit now, but you see, all I'm using is a turkey fryer. Basically, what that is just a turkey fryer hooked into a propane tank. I've got those blocks there. I've got a piece of expanded metal. I've got the bricks there. I've since removed the top layer of brick, but the brick, I used it to hold the heat down and to keep the heat from leaking out, so to speak. But my pans, I'll show you in just a second, but there is the bottom side of what I'm using there. So your evaporator, use the heat source that works best for you. Now I'm using, like I said, I'm using the propane. It works great for me. In the words of my dad, he said, I had rather buy propane than I would chop wood. So I guess that makes sense there. So use the heat source that works best for you. One of the cool things about propane is at the end of the night, if I decide on if I come in from work on a Friday evening and I've got a lot of sap and I know I'm going to have more on Saturday and I start boiling, at the end of the night, I get tired. I can shut it off. I can shut the propane off. I can cover my pans up and go to the house. And whereas with a heat source, with wood, you got to put it out. You got to put the fire out, or you may even, if it's too low and you've got too much of fire there, you may end up scorching the pan. But use the heat source that works best for you. Wood, propane, like I mentioned, are excellent sources. So go with either one that works best. Nothing here is concrete. One of the things you'll do is when you start with this and you start to doing some more research after the night on this, one of the things you'll do is you'll find out what works the best for you, and what works best for me may not work best for you, and what works best for you may not work best for me. So these are just kind of some ideas. So building that firebox, that's going to help retain the heat and allows the heat to properly rise up to the evaporation pan. Now, one of the things that I did, if you'll notice back here, is I put those block up around it. You see some brick there. And then I'll even block off the front some. If wind blows, it's going to blow against that. It's going to blow against that burner, and it can put it out, or it'll at least knock the fire down. And so if the fire levels drop, that means it's not boiling. And so using a firebox, that's going to help. It allows the heat to properly rise up to the evaporation pan. So boiling the sap, make sure you have plenty of time on hand for boiling and making syrup. This is an all-day process, and it depends on how much sap you have. But this can be an all-day process. At this time, the neighbors show up. I remember we used to have a mailman here, and I can remember one day he showed up 3 times. He showed up the first time to bring my mail, the second time to see how things were going, and then when he got off work, he showed up again to see how things were going. So the neighbors are going to show up, the mailman's going to show up, whatever, and they're going to check out what you're doing, and it gives you time to share with them, hey, this is how I'm making maple syrup here in Southwest Virginia or Southeast Kentucky. Also, it may take 10 hours to properly boil down 10 gallons of sap and make syrup. So basically my pan setup and the way it is, if I use a single pan with a single burner, I'm looking at 10 hours or just under 10 hours. But what I've done is I use a double burner and 2 pans. And so what I can do is I can bring in 10 gallons and boil that down and have it finished to syrup. Using the 2 pans, 2 burners, I can have it finished in about 4.5 hours. Maybe a little quicker than that. So you're looking at about a gallon an hour on that if you're using a single burner, or depending on if you're using wood. Basically, it comes down to your pan. How your pan is designed is what it is. Also, the rule of thumb, we're looking at about 43 to 60 gallons of sap, going to make 1 gallon of syrup. And this is going to vary with those tree species, like I mentioned earlier. It's going to vary in the season as well. It can fluctuate up and down. For instance, you may have a tree that at some point in time of the season is it's giving you sap that is 1.5% sugar. At other times in the season, it may be 0.8% sugar. And I know Shad and Phil both will tell you they have seen that.
Jeremy, I was going to say that it tends to go down during the season. Your best sugar generally, not always, I have seen it go up and then back down, but usually it will fall throughout the course of the season.
It does. It definitely does. And one of the things too, Shad, that I have seen is when I have heavier flows of sap, it tends to be that for some reason my sugar content level will be a little lower during those heavier flows. Don't know why, but that's what I've seen personally. But strain or filter your sap prior to placing it in the boiling or evaporator pan. That's going to remove that debris. That's why I put caps on those jugs. But if you may have some bark or whatever in that sap, so try to strain that or filter it. Boil outdoors. I can't stress that enough. Don't do this inside at all. I have heard horror stories of people talking about how after they boiled some inside, that all the cabinets, they boiled it on the stove and all the cabinets were sticky. And because basically you're creating steam. And as you go into that day, when we start with our 10 gallons, you're concentrating that sap. So at 5 gallons, it's going to be more concentrated, and that steam is starting to smell more like maple syrup. And so in that is you're going to have bits and particles of sugar that's going to stick to things. Matter of fact, if you stay around long enough in a sugar shack or even outside, you're going to have that on your face, on your hands, and so it's going to get sticky. You're going to have that maple sap or that maple sugar, taste that's going to stick to your lips, everything. So, boil outdoors. Also, use a wide flat pan if possible. This is going to increase the surface area. If you use one of the turkey pots, it's going to take you forever. The turkey frying pots is going to take you forever. And so what I typically use, and I'll show you in a little bit, is I typically use one of the food service pans. They make them in what's called a full size food service pan. And they make them in 2 different depths. They make a 4-inch and a 6-inch. When you're buying these things, there's not a lot of price difference between the two. Go with 6 inches. Also, don't let the sap level drop below 1 inch because it may scorch the pan. So at some point in time, what I'm going to have to do is I've started with a large food service pan that's going to hold somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3 gallons. And then I'm going to continue to boil it down, and I'm going to have to switch it to a smaller pan and even to a pot, depending on how much sap that I start with. So when boiling, a white foam is going to form on the surface. You could skim that off. Now, they also make a defoamer, and I love that stuff. Started using that a couple of years ago, and a couple of drops of that when I get started, and I don't have to use any more at all. Just put 2 drops in there. I'm not skimming anything, but if you don't have the defoamer, you're going to have a ladle there or something to skim that white foam off, because that stuff is going to stick to that pan. It's going to be hard to clean it off when it burns to that pan. Also, once your sap is getting close to the surface, you may want to finish it in it should say close to the surface, close to the bottom. You may want to finish it in a smaller pot so you can control the temperature better, because this is when scorching is going to become an issue. So as that sap level drops in your pan, we don't want to get below 1 inch. So what we're going to do is drop it to a smaller pot. And I have before, if I come in with, smallest I've ever done is 5 gallons, and it was horrible. I had rather do 20 gallons of sap than I would 5. But it's what I had, and I had to get it done. And what you're having to do is you're having to start with a bigger pan, you're dropping to a smaller container, and then you're having to drop to even the smaller container on the 3rd go around. So, like I said, it seems to be a whole lot easier to do 22 gallons for me than it is 5. So basically there's my setup. And like I said, I've removed the upper portion layer of bricks, the top layer of bricks. The 2 pans are sitting on the expanded metal. If you'll notice, I have 2 burners rolling there, and it's got a good rolling bowl. That's what you want, is a rolling bowl. And if you'll notice in the corner of those pans, like here along the edges, you'll see that white foam here. And that's that white foam you're going to skim off. Now you'll see I've got a stock pot there. Those work great for warming sap. What I'll do is I'll take a stock pot, I'll fill it full of sap, and I'll set it right here on the corner between these 2 pans. And what happens is it warms this sap. And as the sap level drops in my 2 pans, I'll take a 1 quart kettle, and I'll take and add warm sap back to the pans, the boiling pans, because what you don't want is put cold sap in there, because you're gonna knock the boil. And so the boil doesn't stay down but a minute or so, and it's right back to boiling again, because when you get started, that's those pans are going to be running right there. It's probably boiling right there somewhere around 200 and I would say somewhere around 208 degrees. Well, after that pan sits there, or that pot sits there a while, that stock pot with that cold sap in there, as you continue to add to it, it's going to increase to about 105 degrees or something. And so you're going to be able to add to that easier. Here's Woody's setup. Woody's got a little bit different setup here. And if you'll notice, his warming pan's in the back. And he's got a single burner up front. And he's even got a thermometer there. That's the white pipe. He's got a thermometer that he's constantly monitoring the temperature. And there's that white foam again that you got to keep skimmed off. And so his warming pan's in the back, and so it's actually closer to the burner, and so it's getting a little bit of heat, and it may even evaporate some. It's going to evaporate some. So he'll add from the back pan to the near pan until he gets it finished. So you're going to have a lot of time. You may grab a magazine. I jerked out a copy of the Maple News and sat and read it one night. And then in the, that's on the left. On the right, if you'll notice, the evaporator makes a great French fry warmer. And if you'll notice in the background there, it was dark. That was one of those all day, probably a 12-hour boil. And so there you go. But if you'll notice in the picture on the left, on the right is actually just water that's sitting in that pan. On the left, the pan on the left is actually still boiling. And so it's probably got 1.5 inches of sap in there. So it won't be long. And I'm going to transfer that over to a different pot, something smaller. So finishing the syrup. This is where we have spent 10 hours, 12 hours working on this stuff. Sap becomes syrup when it reaches 67% sugar and 33% water. That's when it actually is syrup. It'll start looking like syrup before then. It'll start tasting like syrup before then, but it's actually syrup at 67% sugar. An inexpensive way to measure is when the syrup reaches 7.5 degrees above the boiling point of water. For instance, here at my house, and probably at your house too, the boiling point of water is going to run really close to 209 degrees. And so the syrup, I'm going to be able to take that off when it turns 216. And that is going to fluctuate a little bit with barometric pressures. And there's phone apps out there that'll give you the correct boiling point of water, and they give you what you need to take it off at, and so on and so forth. But if you're looking at about, if you boiling water at 209, you need to take it off at 216, 216 and a half. A more accurate way to invest in a syrup hydrometer and a cup or a refractometer. I have both, and I love the refractometer. I've been using that for a refractometer for about 3 years now, and I really like it. Matter of fact, I have a couple of hydrometers, and I have not used them in a long time, but I like the refractometer. I showed you earlier the manual refractometer. If you want to invest money in one, you can get a digital one for about $150, maybe even closer to $125. That's a little bit more accurate and easier to read. Also, you're not going to stir that sap. If you're familiar with making sorghum, you do not stir the sap as it's cooking. You let it boil. So here I am. I've reduced down. If you'll notice, I'm in a small stock pot. I've reduced down, and my temperature appears to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 210, 208 degrees there. So I've still got a little bit ways to go, but you can see that it's no longer a clear liquid, which is what sap is. I'm starting to get that amber tint to it. And so I'm switching over to a stock pot. And then there's a 2 quart. And I've had to switch to it. I've had to switch down to that and to finish him, because I probably started with less than 10 gallons to get to that point. And so at that point in time, you'll notice it's a darker tint. It's gotten a little darker, and you can see it sitting there on the expanded metal and the burner underneath it. And if you'll notice, it doesn't have a lot of flame on it. At this point in time, I've backed it off. Now right here, the last 15 minutes that you're boiling is really tense because you can spend 12 hours in a day, boiling, and you can burn your pan and ruin everything. And I've come close. Knock on wood, I've not ruined any sap or syrup yet, but I've come really, really close. And I've had some what I call heavy syrup. In other words, it's hit 70% sugar, that sort of thing. But you gotta watch it. You can't just, when you start boiling sap beginning of the day, you can walk off and leave it, go in the house, grab a sandwich like that. When it gets to this stage right here, you got to stay with it. And you're constantly checking the temperature, and you're constantly checking the bricks as well. So filtering and canning, last step. Filtering and canning, like I said, last steps. Syrup needs to be between 180 to 185 degrees when filtered and canned. You're going to pour the syrup through a coffee filter or an Harlan filter. Here's what I typically use. I use an Harlan filter, and I also use a pre-filter on it that saves my Harlan a little bit. And so what I do is, as soon as I take it off at 216 degrees, I pour it through that filter, the Harlan. And all that is a synthetic wool. So I pour it through the Harlan filter, and it drains into another pot. And once I finish draining it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat it back up. I'm going to take it in the house, heat it back up 180 to 185. Now, once you get up about 190, you got to be really careful. You're going to create, you could create a sugar sand in there. So what you're doing is it creates a sugar sand. It's a natural substance, and we'll talk a little bit about it in just a second. But it creates a natural substance in the bottom of it when it's boiled. And so what you're doing is you're filtering, you're getting rid of that sugar sand. If you go and buy a nice glass jar of commercially produced syrup, you're going to notice it's going to be clear. If you come to my house and look at one of mine, there's a chance you may end up with some sugar sand at the bottom. I'll try to show you all one a little bit. So the filter process is going to collect that sugar sand or the niter. Like I said, it's naturally occurring as you're boiling. Some sugar sand may still be present after filtering, but that's not an issue. It's not a bad thing. You could get a lot of your bigger producers, they use filter presses to get that out. But I've had some syrup that had very little in it, and I've had some that had a lot, and I've had some that almost had none, just filtering one time. So after filling the container, tightening the lid, I lay the container on its side for a few seconds or turn it upside down so the hot syrup comes in contact with the container, thus sterilizing the container. And I set it aside. And like anything else, what's going to happen is that lid's going to pop. If you're canning, it's just like canning. You're going to step away from it and let it seal. And then later, you may try it on some pancakes or some ice cream. So you can even take this stuff, you can turn it into cookies, candies. Now, one of the things is peanuts and mixed nuts. If you'll take 2 cups of syrup, you heat it to 245 degrees, and when it hits 245, you dump 3 pounds of nuts in there and stir it, and stir it, and stir it, and stir it until it goes from a glossy color to a dull color. Those are great maple peanuts or maple mixed nuts. Dump it out on a cookie sheet, let it cool, and it's wonderful. So when we finish the season, sap flow, Eastern Kentucky, Southwest Virginia is going to enter around the first to mid part of March. Now, it's going to be weather dependent. If it warms up in February and it stays around 70, which we've had a few of those periods the last couple of years, we've had those early springs, these trees are going to start to bud out. And when they start to bud out, that sap is going to start to turn yellow. It's going to be cloudy, and it's going to have a really bad smell, and you're not going to want to make syrup out of there. It's can no longer be used for syrup. It's called what we call buddy sap. Good rule of thumb is actually to stop collecting when the buds of the maples begin to break open. So if you see them break open, that's when you want to stop. Now, if you have sugars will tend to break the last, is what we typically see. They're the last ones to break. The silvers break early, and they're going to be the first ones, and then the reds are usually in the middle. So when finished, clean all your supplies, and you're going to pack it away for the next season. You don't want to start the next season washing stuff or attempting to wash stuff. So if you'll clean it all now, at the end of the season, it's going to be ready to go, and you're not going to have to worry about anything. So I'm at the end. I noticed there were some things that come up in the chat, I think. I did, yes, Justin. I did say you cannot reuse taps, the plastic taps. Do not reuse those. They can harbor a bacteria on those to actually shut the tree down. Now, if you use the metal spiles, the aluminum, or the metal spiles, which are these, you can actually boil those and reuse those. What I use is a plastic spile there, and it works great. They make them in several different designs, types. These are a 5/16 inch spile. They work great. Woody said the weather will affect boiling time. It does. Barometric pressure will affect it. And like he said, it will evaporate some in his warming pan. Can you tap the same tree next year? And do you need a tap to tap a different hole? Or can you retap the same hole? Good question, Aaron. I didn't cover that. Yes, and what you typically want to do is do not tap the same hole. Actually, you're not even going to tap near that hole. It's going to create dead wood around that hole. And so what I typically do is I move 6 inches to the left or the right, and I go 4 inches above or below that hole at the very least. But I do not retap the same hole, no, because it's going to create a dead wood, and in that dead wood, sap will not flow in there. So you want to go at least 6 inches. You cannot get any sap from an oak tree. Well, you'll get sap from an oak tree, but technically you will not get any sap from an oak tree or a hickory tree. I've done both. When you're out identifying trees in the middle of the winter with 30 minutes of daylight with no binoculars, it's tough. Beech tree, no. Now, walnut, you can, and Phil may want to hit on something here, or shad. You tap walnut, you can tap sycamore. But I've never heard anybody doing beech. Let me give you an idea of what I've got here. Is, if you can see it here, I've got my tap, and it's attached to a short piece of tubing. This piece of tubing is about 6 inches in length. And if you'll notice, the cap is attached here, and then that goes into the top of my milk jug. And then I'll have a piece of wire here, and it hangs down and it loops through the handle on the milk jug to hold the milk jug. So basically the tap is holding the milk jug up, and it has worked well for me. I've never had any issues. About the only thing is, if I get a jug that fills up to a gallon, and it'll create some weight and it may pop loose. But that's about the only issue. I've used the snaps. I like use the screw-ons. I do know that Woody uses, he's used the screw-ons in the past. I typically like the snap-on, so it doesn't matter on the lids there. Shad mentioned birch, some hickory, sycamore, walnut, and maples and box elder can be tapped. But what I will add is, when you're looking for supplies, when you go to, there are several great suppliers out there. But what I've done is, typically I had bought taps off of them. But the first time I did this, I went and bought a kit and I went and bought this kit on eBay. There's kits, and what these kits will be is they'll be like 10 or 20 of these taps or a tap similar to that, and they'll have like 20 foot of this tubing, this blue tubing here, and in that kit. And so you can buy, say, 20 taps, 20 foot of tubing for shipping and everything, $30. And so if you only have a few trees, that's what I would do. Because the thing is when you buy, if you're looking at doing what I'm doing here, there's one of the companies out there, I can't remember which one exactly, they will sell you a minimum size or a minimum size of 100 feet of tubing. You're never going to use that much. Matter of fact, probably since this was my 5th year this year, and I think I've only used like less than 20 feet. You know, I'm making these things out of 6 inches, and I reuse these. The tubing part, I reuse this. The tap, it gets tossed. I reuse the lid. So I wash that up. I wash my my tubing just with clean water and let it dry and then store it out of the way. But the tap goes. But the tubing, if you want to use the tubing for the jugs, what I would do is look at a kit, and the kits are really inexpensive. And because the thing is, you go to a lot of these suppliers, you're going to have to buy a 1,000 foot roll, 500 foot roll. You're never going to use that. And so you can find some of these kits, like I said, on eBay. You may even check one of these maple suppliers. They may be putting the kits together. I've suggested that before, but buy the kits, and they're fairly inexpensive. I mentioned the hammer earlier. All I use is a 7-ounce hammer. You use something smaller than that. It's easier to pack through the woods. The first year I used a 16-ounce hammer, and that's packing around 16 ounces of hammer. And so a 17-ounce or 7-ounce hammer works great because you're not driving nails. You're just tapping taps. I mentioned the sugar sand earlier. I don't know if you might be able to see that there. That's sugar sand in the bottom. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's just a white substance that's in the bottom. And you can eat that. As a matter of fact, Shad, Phil, and I learned from a producer up in Maine that they were actually taking that sugar sand and using it as a hand scrub and a facial scrub. So there's a use for everything there. Also, Woody mentioned a little 4-ounce hammer or a kid's hammer work well. So yeah, like I mentioned earlier as well, rubber mallet, this 7-ounce hammer works great for me, that sort of thing. Any other questions? You can even unmute, whatever. I know we're right at the end time. Shad, Phil, y'all have anything to add?
Good job, Jeremy.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Is anybody on here that's currently, other than Woody and Phil, anybody on here that's currently tapping maples?
Chris and Paxton are 5 years experience with it now.
Awesome. Cool. Good deal. Good deal. Well, Aaron, Jerry, if y'all are not doing this, go hunt some maple trees and try it out. You got a great guy right there as a county extension agent. He's doing a good job over there with maple, and so catch up with him. He'll show you the ropes. It's a load of fun. One of the things is this is something that you're doing at a time of the year that nothing else is going on. You're doing this stuff in January and February. Unless you're out fishing on cold days, you're not doing much. There's nothing to plant. You're not harvesting anything. And so it works great unless you're feeding cows. And then there's some days that I've spent 12, 14 hours out behind my house and thought, I'd rather be feeding cows. But a lot of times what I'll do is I'll go out, I'll turn, Woody mentioned it's addictive, and it is. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll go out and get the evaporator started, crank the radio up, If the Cats are playing, I'll listen to them play ball. And you get to listen to the pregame, the game, the postgame, the talk show. I mean, you're out there for a lot of times, and then there's some nights you can even tune in a game off the West Coast.
Jeremy, I have a question about the tap. You said you only use it one time.
Mm-hmm.
You do remove it from the tree, though, don't you?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. Yes, what I'm doing is at the end of February, what I'm doing is end of March or 1st of March. When I see that there's no more sap flow, I'm going in there and I'm pulling taps. I'm taking my taps out. And at that point in time, I'll take them to the house. I'll take the taps out of that tubing and just pull it out. It pulls apart easy, and then it goes back together easy as well. And so I'll pull that apart, and then I'll take the tubing and I'll put it in some water and I'll soak it, and I'll make sure it's really clean. The tap, I toss it, or I hang on to them for demonstrations or whatever. I hang on to the tubing, wash it, make sure it's clean. I'll let it dry, and then I'll bag it up and put it with all my maple supplies for next year, and I'll reuse that little short piece of tubing. 6-8 inches is all you need on something like that.
You ever have any trouble with wildlife bothering?
Yes, bears.
Bears?
Yeah, on the jugs themselves. Now, when you get into tubing, like those long strands of tubing that I showed you there, when you get into tubing, they have issues with squirrels. They could have issues with deer, elk, bears knocking it down. But on the jugs, I have had 3 jugs actually destroyed by bears. Matter of fact, even had everything right up to the end of the tap here destroyed by a bear one year. And so if there's bears in the area, and I've got bears in the area, and I've only had that happen on 3 jugs. It was 2 jugs one night, 1 jug a different night, maybe even a different year. I think it was even a different year. And so it was nothing major. But that's the only wildlife issue I've had on the jugs. Good question. Good question, everybody.
Can you distinguish?
I see Aaron has mentioned if it has been 7 days and your tree isn't producing sap anymore, should you retap somewhere else if the temps get better for that same season? No. What you're going to typically see, Aaron, is that's going to be late in the season anyway when it dries up, unless you tap too early. If you went in there and tapped in December, the end of December, and it dried up and you're getting into first part of February, I typically do not retap. I've never had to retap. There has been some research done that they will go back in there, pull the tap, and take a drill and drill a little bit deeper. But I don't necessarily recommend that. But I just call it up as maybe a loss. But it can be weather reasons that the weather just stays too warm or too cold. But typically we see it'll stay too warm, which happens at the end of the season. But I've had it to stay down into below 32 for a week, and it just frees up. But then when it warms back up, it starts flowing great. You had a question, Jerry, or comment?
Oh yeah. Can you distinguish the flavor between red maple and silver maple, or is it all taste about the same?
I have not. Here's the way I look at it. I put it all together. I mix it all together. Red, sugar, silver. Most of what I'm tapping are reds. And I've had a few sugars, very few. Most of what I'm tapping are reds, and so I mix it all together. And so here's what I've seen in the silver is when I was using silver, because it had a lower sap concentration or a lower sugar concentration, I had to boil it longer, and I typically had a more sugar sand or niter at the end because I had to boil it longer. So that's the only thing I've seen, but I've never seen a flavor difference. Phil, do you want to comment on that? I know you've tasted the varieties that were held out.
I don't have a real sensitive taster, so you could probably probably give me motor oil, and I wouldn't know a whole lot of difference. But yeah, I guess there's some subtle things that we've seen. I know that somebody told me once that, and we had to do this a lot. We would cook it down to a certain point, and then we'd stop the fire and come back the next day and fire it back up. And we noticed that it would get darker. But as far as the taste, I couldn't
Right.
detect anything. Chris or Paxton, do you all have any comments on that?
I will add on the taste, Jerry. Taste is actually can be a geographic location. The taste of the syrup down here in Southeast Kentucky, Southwest Virginia is different than what it is in Maine or Wisconsin. I've tried it in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Wisconsin. And there's a different taste with all of them. We tend to have what I refer to as a smoother taste. It's a little it takes a little buttery flavor. So that's my opinion. Has a buttery flavor to it, just a little smoother than it is in other states. I've actually tried it out of Pennsylvania as well. So each of them have a little, and the taste will change from year to year. I have some that'll taste different this year than it did last year or the year before. So it'll change a little bit, but we tend to have a smoother taste down here. Good question. How much sap do you get per tree average? It varies from year to year. Like I said, I've got one or two trees. They flow really good. And then I've got a tree that'll be right next to them that won't flow. If I pick up a gallon on this tree, I may not pick up 3 or 4 ounces. It seems like on the tree next to it. So it just depends. Just depends year to year. And for instance, I can give you. For instance, I had 16 taps last year and had 58 and a half gallons of sap and finished with about 3/4 of a gallon of syrup. So that varies, from year to year, that sort of thing. It'll vary from different points in the season, but good question. Just a fluctuation. Anything else?
If you don't, say you don't collect a jug and it completely fills up and it's kind of backed up in the tube all the way to the tree, and you put on a fresh jug, do you get a pretty intense flow for a little while until it kind of, does it back up?
No, here's what's happened. It'll overflow. It'll push the cap off. It's going to flow. And because it gets heavy and it just overflows, but it will not back up. So typically what I'm doing is I'm checking that tree every day, nearly at the same time every day. So I'm checking it every 24 hours. If I know that there's a flow, if I know that, that it's been 20 last night and 40 today, I'm headed to check trees. I know what I'm going to have to do at dark. I'm going to be checking trees and collecting sap. And now if I see it that it stops or if it goes below freezing, for any extended time, below freezing is a high, and I'm going to stop checking for a few days until it starts to warm back up. But it won't back up in the tree. It'll pop the lid off or start leaking out somehow. Good question. Anything else? I hope you all look into this. I do. Let's see. Woody mentioned if a tree is filling a gallon jug each day, switch to a 5-gallon bucket. There you go. Just switch to something else, or put a T in and put you another bucket in there. I do want to mention a couple things real quick. I want to add these to the chat. These two websites. This is a really good publication here from Missouri. So you want to click on that or save that somehow. That is Backyard Maple Sugaring, Guide to Backyard Maple Sugaring. It comes from Missouri. but it's really good. I want to also throw a plug out as well for the Kentucky Maple Syrup school that's coming up on November the 7th. It's virtual. There's the other website as well. And let me share my screen right quick. You can see there we've got 3 great speakers there. We've got Glenn Goodrich with Goodrich Maples. He actually started out in 1979 with 25 taps. And he, this past year, he was considered to be the 6th. He ranked number 6 in a number of maple taps in the nation. So he's up to around 125, 130,000 taps now. So he's going to talk about how he started as a backyard tapper and become a maple producer. Also, we'll have Ben McKinney, who's a friend of Shad, Phil, and I. He is a 5th generation maple producer in Maine, and he's going to talk about cooking with maple syrup. Also, more than maple, Kate Photos with Future Generations University in West Virginia. She's going to be talking about making walnut syrup. So there's a registration link right up here. And so it's going to be from 9 a.m. to 12:30 on November the 7th. That is a Saturday. So we'd love to have you. Registration's free. You'll need to register, because what they'll do is they'll send you the link. It'll be via Zoom, so y'all are used to that. And hopefully you'll join us. But that's all I had, unless there's any other questions or comments. Glad to have y'all on here tonight, listening to me ramble about maple syrup. Phil, anything else, or you want to cover anything on next week?
I guess Tuesday we've got coming up a buddy of mine from North Carolina State University. He's going to be talking about cowboy ethics, the code of the West. And I've never heard this presentation, but it's something that he's presented on several times. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that's about.
Sounds good. And then on Thursday, we had a really good photographer lined up, but there was some issues that came up, and so you have to deal with me instead. So we're going to talk about basic photography on Thursday.
Indeed.
But that's
Jeremy,
all I have.
Great job, Jeremy. I enjoyed that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sir. Thank you all for the questions and the comments. Great interaction tonight. But great to see everybody again, and hopefully I'll see you all on Tuesday then.
Thank you, Jeremy.
All right. Everybody have a good weekend.
You too.